Wyoming Territory, late spring of 1879, the wind was sharp, the sun unrelenting, and the stagecoach wheel gave out with a crack that snapped straight through the dry silence of the plains. Vera Calloway barely had time to brace herself before the whole rig lurched sideways, throwing her hard against the wooden frame. She hit the ground in a tangle of skirts and dust, the coach groaning behind her like a dying thing. The driver cursed once, then went silent. When she pulled herself up, dirt in her mouth, hands scraped raw, she saw the front axle splintered, the horses pawing the earth nervously, and no other soul on the trail for miles. "This cannot be happening," she whispered, pressing a hand to her temple. Her bonnet had flown off. Her carpet bag had split open, scattering her books, a small tin of tea, and the photograph of her parents that was already fading with time. She gathered what she could, her movements stiff, her corset biting. The driver, old and worn thin by road and whiskey, spat in the dirt. "Ain't no fixin' this without another wheel. Closest relay station's 20 miles east. Can we walk?" "I ain't walkin' nowhere," he grunted. "I'll wait here. You do what you want." Vera turned in a slow circle, nothing but miles of golden grass and low blue sky. She was 24 with no brothers left, no husband ever, and not enough money to hire another ride. She had left Missouri to take a teaching job in Sheridan, the letter promising room and board and a place to begin again. Now she stood alone with the wind in her ears and a broken stagecoach behind her like a snapped promise. She did not cry. She sat on her carpet bag and waited. It was 2 hours later when she heard the hoofbeats, slow and steady. One rider. She stood, brushing her skirt off, her heart suddenly too loud in her chest. The man who approached wore sun-bleached denim and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Dust covered his boots and a rifle was slung across his back. He was not much older than her, maybe late 20s, with a lean build and a face that had seen weather and time. His horse was a tall dun gelding, steady under his hand. He slowed as he neared the wreck, eyes scanning the damage, then resting on her. "You all right?" he asked, voice rough from the trail. "I am now," she said, lifting her chin. "The driver says it is 20 miles to the nearest station." His gaze flicked to the coach. "That wheel's done for." "Yes, I gathered." He dismounted in one clean motion. Up close, his eyes were a clear, surprising green. He looked at her a moment longer than he needed to. "Name's Orin Dempsey. Headin' north." "Vera Calloway. I'm going to Sheridan." He nodded, then crouched near the broken axle. "You came across the flats in this thing." "It was not my idea," she said coolly, though her knees still ached from the fall. "But it was the only coach I could afford." He stood again, dusting his hands. "You should not stay out here, not alone. Rattlers, cougars, worse." She folded her arms. "I'm aware. I can take you." "Got room on the saddle. Sheridan's on my way." She hesitated. He waited without pressing. The wind tugged at her skirt, and far behind them the sun began to dip toward the hills. "All right," she said finally. He helped her onto the gelding, his hand steady at her waist. When she was settled behind him, he climbed up, and they started north with the sun on their backs. The first hour passed in silence, save for the creak of leather and the occasional call of a bird overhead. Vera held to the saddle horn, trying not to lean too close, though the warmth of him was impossible to ignore. "You from Missouri?" he asked eventually. "I was. My family's gone now. I had an offer to teach. I thought it was time to make my own start." He nodded. "I ranch north of Sheridan. Cattle, mostly, some horses. My father built it." "Is he still there?" Orin's jaw moved once. "No, just me now." They rode until the sun dipped low and the sky turned to fire. He stopped near a small creek sheltered by cottonwoods. "We camp here," he said, dismounting. She climbed down stiffly, legs aching. He built a fire quick and clean, then handed her a tin cup of strong coffee and a biscuit from his saddlebag. "Thank you," she said, curling her fingers around the heat. "You are welcome." She watched him across the firelight. He moved quietly, efficiently. There was something about him, not just the way he rode or the way he watched the horizon as if expecting trouble, but the way he looked at her like she was someone worth seeing. "You did not have to stop back there," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I did." She met his eyes. "Why?" His gaze held hers steady. "You looked like someone who still had roads to walk. I do not like seeing good people stranded." She smiled, the first real one in days. That night, she lay beneath a blanket near the fire, listening to the night sounds and the soft breathing of his horse nearby. Orin sat awake a while longer, keeping watch. She opened her eyes once and saw him there, outlined against the starlight, rifle across his knees, eyes on the dark. She felt safe. In the morning, he made eggs and coffee. She shared the last of her tea. They rode again, closer now, the silence between them comfortable. By the second day, he had taken to pointing out tracks and naming birds she had never known. She asked questions, and he answered them all with quiet patience. That second night, when she tripped over a root and caught herself against his chest, she laughed, and when he steadied her, his hand lingered just a little longer than it needed to. "You are different than I expected," she said softly. "How so? I thought cowboys were supposed to be reckless." Loud, crude, he looked at her, amused. "Do I disappoint?" "No," she said. "You surprise me." He smiled just a little. By the third day, Sheridan came into view, low buildings, smoke curling from chimneys, the smell of horses and coal in the air. He rode straight to the schoolhouse, helped her down, and did not rush her goodbye. "Thank you," she said, unsure of what else to offer. "Are you staying here long?" he asked. "I signed a year's contract." He nodded once. Then, slowly, "Would it be all right if I called on you?" She looked up at him, heart thudding. "Yes," she said. "It would be more than all right." He tipped his hat, then rode off, the sun catching in his hair. Vera watched him go, her heart full of something new and bright. She had come west for a fresh start. She had not expected to find Orin Dempsey. But now, all she could think was, thank God that Stagecoach broke. The wind had a different sound in town, less wild, more tangled with human things. Boots on boardwalks, hammers, distant laughter. Vera stayed to the edge of it that first week, rising early, setting the schoolroom to order before the children arrived. She learned their names by the third day, the rhythm of their hands on slates, the flicker of mischief in some, hunger in others. She taught from sun up to late afternoon, then stayed behind to mend pages and plan lessons by lamplight. Orin came on the seventh evening. She heard his boots on the porch steps before she saw him through the classroom window. He stood outside for a moment, hat in hand, then knocked on the open door frame. She was still sitting at the desk, ink smudged on her fingers, her spine aching. "I hope this isn't unwelcome," he said. She closed her ink bottle. "It isn't." He stepped inside, slower than before. He wore a clean shirt, the sleeves rolled, a faint mark of saddle leather still on his trousers. He smelled faintly of pine and horsehair and something warm beneath. "I passed by the mercantile," he said. "They've a few new ledgers for sale." "I've already spent my allowance for the month," she said, brushing her palms on her skirt, "but I may do with old shop receipts for the arithmetic boards." He nodded once. "I could send a few from the ranch. We keep books on calves and grain." "Might be useful. I wouldn't want to take from your accounts. There's more than I'll ever need," he said. "Besides, you'd be doing me a favor. They pile up." She stood from her chair, the stiffness in her legs easing as he stepped closer. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I told you I would." It wasn't said with pride, just quiet certainty. Something she was learning came natural to him. The light through the windows turned golden as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pine floor. She could hear the creak of a cart down the road, slow and steady. "I've been thinking," he said, eyes on the chalk shelf. "You came here to start something. That's not easy in a place like this." "No," she said, "it isn't. But you're doing it anyway." She looked up. "And you?" "Did you ever think of leaving?" "I did," he said. "After my father passed, I rode south, spent time in Colorado, Arizona Territory, even crossed into Sonora for a month." "What brought you back?" He shrugged, but his voice was softer. "The land, the way the stars sit over the hills up here." Cattle don't mean much to most men, but they did to him. I guess I wasn't ready to let it all go. She sat again, folding her hands. "I never thought I'd end up this far west. My mother used to say I belonged in books, not out among dirt and wind." "You don't look out of place." "No," he leaned against the doorframe, one hand resting on the wood, the other still holding his hat. "You look like someone who's meant to be here." "Not just passing through." She had no answer for that, Only the pulse of her thoughts and the way her chest ached a little with the weight of it. Not sorrow, not quite hope, something in between. "I saw a boy steal a plum from the general store today," she said to shift the air. "He ran like the devil himself was on his heels. Might have been hungry. I thought that too," she said. "So I let him sit in the back of the schoolhouse, gave him a biscuit and a page from the primer." "Did he stay?" "For a little while." He listened. Orin nodded. "Sometimes that's all it takes." He stepped away from the door. "I'll come again if that's all right." "It is." He hesitated, then placed a small bundle on the desk. "Dried cherries, from the ranch, thought you might like them." She touched the cloth. "Thank you." When he left, she didn't return to her papers. She just sat there, hand resting over the bundle, and let the quiet settle around her like a shawl. 2 evenings later, he brought her a worn volume of poetry, said it had belonged to his mother. Vera turned the pages with care, the corners soft from use. He didn't press her to read aloud, just sat beside her on the steps as the sun slipped away. Days turned to weeks. She saw him at the edge of the churchyard one Sunday, standing alone, hat over his chest. He didn't approach until after the final hymn, when most folk had gone. They walked together down the hill, her hand brushing close to his but never quite touching. Once, he brought her a wildflower wrapped in paper. Another time, a basket of late beans and 2 hens, always without asking. Always with that same quiet steadiness. She began to look for him in the late hours, half listening for hoofbeats when the wind changed. The children began whispering when he lingered by the schoolhouse door. She didn't hush them. Then came the night she stood on her porch, watching a storm roll in over the hills. The air thick, the sky bruised. He arrived just as the first fat drops began to fall. "You shouldn't be out in this," she said, stepping back to let him under the eave. "I couldn't wait another day," he said. Rain streaked his shoulders, his hair already wet. "I've been thinking on something." She watched him, heart suddenly too tight. "I know we've only had a few months. I know it's early still, but this feels right, you and me. I don't want to draw it out if we both know the shape of it." She didn't speak, not yet. "I've got a house big enough for 2, a good roof, a place you could read under the windows in the morning, and the hens, they'd come too." The rain picked up, drumming steady on the roof. She stepped closer, the space between them gone in a breath. "I came west for a beginning," she said. "I didn't expect to find a man like you." "I didn't expect to stop for a broken wheel," he said, "but I'm glad I did." She reached up, touched his jaw, calloused and warm. "I'll marry you, Orin Dempsey," she said. "If you're asking." He bent his head, pressed his forehead to hers. "I'm asking." The rain kept falling, but neither of them moved. The storm passed, and when it did, the world smelled of wet earth and something new. The wedding was quiet, held in the back room of the church with the windows open and the scent of lilac drifting in on the breeze. No organ, no choir, just reverend bell, a Bible worn thin at the corners, and a handful of neighbors who'd come to see it done. Mrs. Alcott brought a peach pie in a tin, and young Thomas Bridger offered a fistful of wild sage as a gift, shy and proud in his patched coat. Vera wore a dress borrowed from the seamstress's older sister, ivory cotton with a row of tiny buttons down the back. Orin had shaved that morning, his hair still damp where he'd washed it in the creek. He stood with his hands folded, boots clean, jaw firm. After the vows, they walked to the edge of town on foot, side by side, passing a field where a few boys were tossing stones at a tin can. Vera kept her hand near his arm but didn't take it, not yet. They didn't speak much. There wasn't need. The cart was waiting near the feed store, 2 wheels, 1 bench, and a crate tied down with rope. Orin helped her up, then climbed in beside her, flicking the reins. The road out of Sheridan was lined with soft hills, and they rode through them without hurrying. "Does that fence line belong to you?" she asked after a while, nodding toward a stretch of cedar posts. "No," he said. "That's old McCready's claim. Ours is further on." "Past the bluff," she turned slightly. "Ours," he glanced over. "That's the way of it now, isn't it?" She looked toward the horizon, where the land rolled out wide and unbroken. "It is." The house came into view near dusk, 2 rooms, rough-hewn logs, a porch with a rocking chair that leaned slightly to the right. A chimney curled smoke into the sky, and a thin brown dog lifted its head from the stoop but didn't bark. The barn stood 100 paces off, sloped to one side, whitewash peeling. "It's not much," Orin said, pulling the cart to a stop. "It's honest," she answered, stepping down. "That's more than most." He carried the crate inside while she ran a hand over the porch rail. The wood was warm from the sun, nicked in places, but solid. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and something faintly sweet. A tin kettle rested on the stove, and a quilt lay folded at the foot of the bed. A single oil lamp burned on the table. "I wasn't sure how to set it up," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Didn't know what you'd want changed." "I'll learn the corners as I go," she said. Homes aren't made in a day. That night, she unpacked the few things she'd brought: her books, a pressed handkerchief, a small mirror with a crack down one side. He set her things on a shelf he'd cleared, then lit another lamp. They didn't speak much, just moved around each other quietly, like two pieces finding where they fit. When the fire burned low, he turned to her, his expression uncertain for the first time that day. "You all right?" "I am," she said, meeting his eyes. "Are you?" He gave a slow nod. She stepped closer, her voice soft. "You don't have to be careful with me, Orin, not like I'll break." He didn't answer right away, just reached forward, brushing his fingers along the edge of her jaw, then rested his palm against her cheek. "I don't want to rush what ought to be steady," he said quietly, "but I do want to begin." "You already did," she said. They stood a long moment like that, the room quiet, the oil lamp flickering behind them. When he kissed her, it wasn't hurried. It was slow and certain, like a man who knew the weight of silence and had chosen something better. The days that followed fell into rhythm. Each morning, she rose before the sun, started the fire, and boiled water while he fed the stock. They ate together at the small table, her tea steeped in the cup he'd carved from bone, his coffee bitter and black. He showed her the layout of the land, the creek that ran behind the barn, the thicket where deer sometimes passed at dawn. She kept a journal, noting what grew near the fence, what birds came near the eaves. One afternoon, she found a carved box on the kitchen shelf, filled with dried apple slices and a single blue ribbon. She turned to see him leaning in the doorway, arms crossed. "My mother's," he said. "She never had a daughter, thought maybe you'd want to keep it." She opened the box again, more slowly this time. "Thank you." That evening, she made a stew from salt pork and beans, and he brought in kindling without being asked. The dog settled at the hearth, and the wind shifted through the cracks under the door, but the house held. Later, sitting beside him on the porch, she asked, "Did you ever think you'd have this?" "No," he said. "Didn't figure I'd find someone who'd want it. And now," he rested his arm along the back of the bench, "now I think I was just waiting to come across the right broken wheel." She laughed, the sound low and worn with contentment. "I'll mend curtains tomorrow," she said. "And start a little patch for turnips near the barn." "All right." She leaned against him, shoulder to shoulder. "Do you believe in luck?" "I believe in timing," he said. "And grit." She looked out at the fading light, the fields turning silver. "Then maybe this is both." He turned his head, pressed a kiss to her temple. "Maybe it is." Rain came late in the season, heavy and cold, drumming on the cabin roof like a long, forgotten rhythm. Vera stood barefoot on the porch, watching the sky spill itself across the hills, the hem of her dress damp where it brushed the wood. Inside, Orin was oiling the tack by lamp glow, seated on a stool near the stove. The fire had burned low, casting the room in a soft amber hush. She turned from the doorway and stepped in, closing the door behind her with a dull thud. "You ever seen it fall like this in October?" she asked, wringing water from her braid. He didn't look up. "Not since I was a boy, lost a mule in the wash that year." Took 3 days to find what was left. She crossed to the stove, lifted the kettle, and poured the last of the hot water into their cups. The room smelled of leather, pine ash, and the faint trace of yeast from the loaf she'd baked that morning. "I found a letter in the school ledger," she said, settling across from him. "From a woman who taught here 5 years ago. She wrote about the wind keeping her awake and the children speaking Cheyenne under their breath." Orin rubbed the cloth down the bridle strap, his movements slow. "That'd be before the army cleared the North Trail. There used to be camps along the ridge. Some families stayed, most were moved off." She said she missed the voices more than the quiet. He nodded once, then set the leather aside. I remember when the trading post took beads in exchange for grain. There was a man used to ride down from the Tongue River every month, braided silver in his hair, always gave me a dried plum. What happened to him? Hard to say, some just stopped coming. Others were told not to. Vera traced the rim of her cup. There's so much I don't know, you're learnin'. That's more than most care to. The wind pressed against the shutters, low and steady. She leaned back, tucking her feet beneath her. I want to start a gathering in the schoolroom, she said, meeting his eyes. One night a week, nothing grand, just a place where folks can read aloud, share stories, maybe sing if anyone's willing. He gave a quiet hum. You think they'll come? They might. If they're asked right. I'll be there, he said. She smiled, then reached for the sewing basket beside the hearth. Her fingers moved through the folded cloth, pulling out a strip of calico and a needle already threaded. I found this in the bottom, she said, holding it up. Looks like someone started a patch quilt and gave up after 2 squares. That'd be my mother's doing. She meant well but couldn't sit still long. I'll finish it. He watched her work for a moment, then stood and crossed to the door. Rain still fell, softer now, the rhythm easing. You hear that? He asked. She paused, listening. The frogs? No, deeper, she tilted her head. A faint lowing carried through the dark. Sounds like the fence split. He reached for his coat. Stay inside. I'll bring them in. I'll come with you. No need, I said I'll come. He didn't argue again. They moved across the yard together, boots sinking into wet soil. The lantern threw a wide, golden arc across the pasture, and the cattle were clustered near the creek bed, uneasy. 2 posts had snapped under the weight of the storm-swollen water, and the wire hung slack. Orin tied off the loose end while Vera coaxed the nearest heifer away from the edge. Her skirts dragged in the mud and her fingers stung from the cold, but she kept her voice low and her steps steady. When the last of the herd had been turned and the gap patched with a spare rail and rope, they stood together at the edge of the field, breath rising in white clouds. Your hands all right? He asked. She flexed them once. Not broken. You don't flinch from much. She looked up at him, the lantern light catching the rain on his collar. I did once. Before I left Missouri, I was always waiting for something to fall apart. He didn't speak, just reached out and took her hand, rough palm folding over hers. It's different now, she said. He gave a quiet nod, then led her back toward the house. Their steps slow through the soaked grass. Later, after they'd dried by the fire and laid the quilt squares out across the table, Vera turned to him beneath the lamplight. I want to plant apple trees in spring, a whole row west of the barn. He leaned his elbow on the table, chin in hand. That'll take some years, I know. He looked at her a long moment, then said, I'll build a bench there. For when they bloom. She reached across the table and touched his wrist, her thumb brushing the edge of his scar from an old branding iron. You're the only thing I've ever trusted to last. He didn't answer with words, just leaned forward and kissed her hand, gentle and sure. And the rain kept falling, soft now, steady, like it meant to stay. By early March, snow still clung to the north-facing slopes, but the earth had softened enough for planting. Vera stood at the edge of the pasture, her coat tugged close with a scarf tied under her chin, surveying the row where the apple saplings would go. Orin was setting the last stake, his breath visible in the morning chill. They'll need protection from the deer, she said, holding a roll of wire fencing. I've got some netting stored in the loft, he answered, straightening. From when I tried corn 3 years back, didn't take. You never mentioned that, didn't seem worth the telling. I was stubborn, not smart. She leaned down, pressed her glove into the soil, and smiled at the give of it. You've learned since. After the planting, they warmed by the stove with a tin of molasses biscuits she'd baked the night before. She read to him from a volume she'd borrowed from the school's small lending shelf, a story about a family that crossed from Kentucky to Oregon with nothing but a mule and a fiddle. Orin listened with his eyes half closed, one foot resting on a stool, his fingers tapping slowly against his knee. Later he stood and stretched, then walked to the cedar chest tucked beneath the window. I've got something, he said, lifting the lid. She watched as he pulled out a folded piece of linen, then unwrapped it to reveal 2 small brass spoons, dulled by years but unbent. My father's, he said, bringing them to the table. He gave them to my mother their second winter here, said they were all he could offer in place of silver. She turned one over in her palm. They're beautiful. I'd like us to use them, he said. Not store them away. She set the spoon down carefully. Then we will. That Sunday, Vera invited the Bridger children to the house for an afternoon of reading. Their mother had gone to care for her sister in Buffalo and left them under the eye of an older cousin too shy to speak. The boys arrived with wind-burnt faces and a meat pie wrapped in a towel. Vera set them near the hearth, handed them each a biscuit, and opened a new reader she'd ordered from Cheyenne. Orin came in halfway through, wiping his hands on a cloth. He stood quietly near the door, watching as Vera pointed out a word to the youngest boy, her tone steady, her eyes bright with patience. That night, after the children had gone and the house had quieted again, he cleared his throat. "You're good with them," he said. "I've always believed children deserve more than they're given." He took her hand, rough fingers closing around her own. "I want ours to have what we didn't." She looked up, heart catching on the edge of something too big to name. "Do you?" "I do." She didn't answer right away. Just leaned into him as he drew her close, the hush between them filled with the creak of old wood and the slow, sure beat of his heart under her cheek. Weeks later, Vera stood in the schoolyard after dismissal, chalk dust still clinging to her sleeves. The sun had begun to warm the ground and the children had struggled to sit still through their lessons. She looked up the road and saw Orin riding toward her, leading a pack mule behind him. When he dismounted, he held out a parcel wrapped in brown cloth. "From the mercantile," he said. "You mentioned needing paper." She opened it to find a stack of new folios and a jar of ink sealed with wax. "This would have taken a day's work. Didn't cost me more than 2 calves and an afternoon." She set the bundle on the bench. "You didn't need to." "I know." "But I wanted to." She rested her forehead against his chest. "I never knew what it was to be looked after like this. You look after me just as much." In April, they attended a gathering at the church where the women brought seed cakes and the men played fiddle. Vera wore a blue dress she'd sewn from leftover yardage, and Orin smoothed her hair with a tenderness that made her throat ache. They stood near the edge of the room, hands just brushing, and when the music slowed, he asked her to dance. "I'm not graceful," she warned. "I'm not asking for grace," he said. "Just your hand." When they danced, it wasn't the steps that mattered. It was the way he moved with her, steady and sure, as if he'd always known the rhythm of her breath, the way she leaned into him when she laughed softly. That night, back at the cabin, she turned to him by the fire. "I'm with child." He stilled, then stepped forward, cupping her jaw with both hands. "You're certain?" "Yes." He kissed her slow, reverent. "I'll build another room," he said against her temple. "And a cradle. I remember how my father made mine. We'll need to clear out the loft for storage. I'll start tomorrow." She pressed her hands over his. "This life, this place, I didn't think I'd ever be part of something that felt this whole." "You are," he said. "You always will be." Years passed as they do. The apple trees took root, and in their third spring, the first blossoms opened pale against the sky. Vera kept teaching, though she stepped away for a season when their daughter was born. Orin built the cradle just as he promised, each rail sanded smooth, each joint fit clean. Their girl had his eyes and Vera's stillness. She took her first steps between the porch railings and spoke her first word while watching her father mend a gate. They named her Clara, after Vera's mother. Orin never missed a harvest or a birthday. He taught Clara to ride bareback and let her braid his hair when she was small. At night, he and Vera sat on the bench beneath the blooming apple trees, her head on his shoulder, their fingers entwined. They grew older in the way of people who had learned to endure and to love quietly, with purpose. The land held them, and they held each other, through seasons of wind and bloom, through the hush of snowfall and the laughter of children in summer grass. And when strangers asked how they came to be, Vera would smile and say, "A broken wheel and a man who stopped when he didn't have to." But Orin would only look at her, eyes soft with years, and say, "She was the road worth taking." And she always was.